I misspoke last week. This is actually part 46. It really confused me when I said that because it got I'm a fastidious person when it comes to numbering things. And I said last week it was 46. It was really 45. When I went to post it on YouTube, I had 44 and 46 and no 45. And I was like, where's 45? I spent hours looking for my notes on 45 and I'm like, I know we did 45. We hadn't done 40. 45 was last week. This week. And I'm really disappointed none of you called me on it last week. And I was like, wait a minute, Zach, this is actually 40. I'm just playing. 40. When you get to 46 lessons, that's a lot of lessons. So 46 in our series on Matthew's Gospel, the perfect person of God. We've been in this looking at the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, through the particular lens of Matthew, who has elevated the idea of Jesus as the fulfillment of all of the prophetic promises and prophecies and types, and that includes the kingship, the priesthood, sacrificial system. And because Jesus has been, as Matthew has pointed out, in Jesus' teaching and his healing ministry, that has been the case. That creates a fair amount of tension with those who are skeptical. It even does that today. And so the last probably 4 or 5 chapters, we've seen a greater drumbeat of tension in the face of Jesus' ministry, and at the same time, a greater popularity. And what we've seen this in how the religious leaders respond to Jesus when he teaches things, even when Jesus isn't teaching, just responding to his ministry. Jesus is just going to have dinner with some people, and the religious leaders are, why are you eating with those kinds of people? Why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? So there's this tension and there's this conflict that results. But at the same time, and this I think adds to the tension that Jesus faces with the religious leaders, he is becoming more and more popular with people. We saw a few chapters ago, Jesus is teaching, and he's surrounded by some 10,000 people, 5,000 men. That's where you get the first miraculous feeding. And we're going to see today, there is another example of that with 4,000 men, some 7,000 to 9,000 people. So you get this kind of back and forth where Jesus is facing down the confrontation with the religious leaders over the content of his messages and what he's doing, because he's not just preaching things that they don't understand and don't agree with, but he's also doing things that they don't understand, and he's doing it on the basis of authority that they don't agree with. When Jesus casts out demons, he's casting them out by the power of God, but what do they accuse him of? They accuse him of casting out by the power of demons or Beelzebul. Jesus raises a lame person off of a mat and he says, I've forgiven your sins. And they don't look at the miracle. They say, well, that's blasphemy because only God can forgive sins. But the miraculous work and the authority of his teaching also causes great popularity. One of the other things that we've seen, especially recently, this theme is going to continue today, is the subject of faith and strengthening faith. Up to this point, the disciples have been almost background actors in the narrative. They're mentioned here, they're mentioned there. They share moments with Jesus, mainly in boats. They're always in boats with Jesus. And Jesus has sent them on a mission, but he's also, when he speaks to them, quite often in relationship to how they've reacted, he also chastises their faith. I mean, how often thus far have we seen Jesus say to them, "O you of little faith"? Up to this point, twice. We're going to see it a third time today. But there are others in the mix who have great faith. Jesus calls out for having great faith, but should have no reason to have great faith because they're not walking and talking with Jesus all the time. Their faith is based purely on what they've heard about Jesus. So you get the Roman centurion, you get the woman, the Canaanite woman, you get other examples where people's faith is based on simply what they hear about Jesus, and they respond with going to Jesus knowing he can heal them. And yet the disciples who have walked and talked and eaten with Jesus for, at this point, several months, if not a couple of years, they still exhibit little faith. And so that continues to be highlighted again and again. So today we turn to a later part of the back half of Matthew chapter 15, and we're going to maybe get into Matthew chapter 16. But what we get in Matthew 15 and 16 are a couple of passages that have parallel examples earlier in Matthew's gospel. This also happens in Mark's gospel. And it happens also in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, you get a couple of examples in the book of Genesis where Abraham feels somewhat threatened entering into a foreign territory, feels there's a threat to his own life because of the beauty of his wife, who, by the way, is 75 years old. That ought to make you guys feel, I think that's a great testament to her beauty, so much so that he causes her, he compels her to lie about his relationship with her, not once, but twice. And so they're parallel passages. And some people have accused, and this happens in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. The two examples that we're going to talk about over the next couple of weeks is, one, you have a miraculous feeding. You have two miraculous feedings in the first place, and then you have another example of Jesus being asked for a sign. They demand a sign, and Jesus giving the sign of Jonah. Now, the question is that pops up amongst biblical scholars when they look at these passages: is the second passage or the second instance what they call a doublet? A doublet is the retelling, the re-recording of the exact same event. Not two events, one event that they talk about twice. Now, we're just going to really focus on the New Testament rendering for right now. We're not going to look at the Old Testament doublets because those are, we're only going to really talk about the miraculous feeding for just a second before we get into the details of it. But this also does apply to the case of Jesus and his conversation with the Pharisees about the demands for a sign. Some people have looked at the two different feedings in Matthew's gospel and in Mark's gospel and said, yes, this is an example of a doublet. It's one event, one historic event that is recorded twice, and recorded twice for theological reasons. And the first kind of narrative about the miraculous feeding is focused on the Jewish population. If you go back to some of the symbolism we talked about, it is emblematic of the Jewish banquet and the eschatological kind of banquet that will be shared by all of God's people. And the second, the feeding of the 4,000, because of the lesser number that is put in there, is a symbolic of the inclusion of the Gentiles in this same eschatological banquet. This is due in large part to the hypothesis that the Decapolis region, where Jesus has just done the healing miracle, was more of a Gentile enclave, and so the miraculous feeding is to predominantly Gentile people. People that believe that the second is a doublet of the first point to the fact that Luke's gospel makes no mention of a second feeding. John's gospel makes no mention of a second feeding. They also talk about the relative similarity in tone and the context. And this is a big one. They look at the second feeding, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, that the disciples seem not to know anything about the first feeding, and that Jesus has the ability to break bread and create a feast for multitudes of people. In the second case, they contend they should have said, oh, well, It's no big deal we don't have very much food. Jesus did this once. He can certainly do it again. Donald Hagner also believes that the double feeding, that this is a doublet, because Matthew is trying, and Mark as well, is trying to demonstrate Jesus' connection to Moses and to Elijah. We have seen that connection already in Matthew's gospel, but Moses and Elijah also were part of two, not one, two miraculous feedings. There is a general assumption in this case that Matthew is not an eyewitness to the events. There's a general assumption. If you contend that this is a doublet, then there's a general assumption that Matthew is not an eyewitness to the event. But there is the alternate side, that it is not a doublet, meaning it's not the same event recorded twice. It's actually two separate events, two separate historic realities. Frank Gaebelin and Greg Keener both assume that this is two separate events. And Gaebelin points out that there are some similarities, but he also points out there are many differences. And more than that, this is the thing that I find really compelling. When Matthew is recording, and Mark especially, because Mark is a little earlier, when they're recording their gospel narratives, they're talking about just a few decades between the events when they occurred and the recording and the dissemination of the first gospel, meaning that people in the region of Galilee would still be alive who experienced the miraculous events and then are reading about the reporting of those miraculous events. And the acceptance of the gospels is based on their integrity to the truth. If there had only been one feeding and two recorded, it diminishes the credibility of the overall gospel message. Yeah. That's what we're about to get to. I'm just about to, literally more than that, Matthew 16, 9 and 10, and Mark 8 through 19 and 20, Jesus himself makes an argument that there's not one, but two miraculous feedings. He actually points to the lack of the disciples' recognition and says, wait a minute, how do you not understand what I'm able to do? Was that what you're going to say? Okay, good. See, we're like this. It's great. So the evidence of the Scripture itself, and when Orthodox Bible scholars and Bible readers are trying to determine the validity of a Scripture, which we always assume is valid, our baseline assumption is that it's valid. We go back to what the Scriptures say about themselves. Like that, what is the self-evidence? What is it self-evidentiary material? And in Matthew 16, Jesus talks about two feedings. Also, just because there are two historic feedings does not mean there's not a theological, redemptive, historic rationale. See, in the place, and I think Donald Hagner's a great comment. I think the Word Bible Commentary is a great commentary. I disagree with him on this point, but there's an assumption that just because something happens for theological reasons in the gospel, it must not necessarily be accurate. Rather than saying, because God is in control of all of history, God might have theological reasons for having two events. So that does not mean that the first feeding couldn't be a sign of the Jewish eschatological banquet, and the second indicating the inclusion of Gentiles in the great eschatological banquet. That theological premise does not preclude the fact that there were actually two events. There's that assumption that just because something is theological, is recorded for a theological purpose, that it automatically means it's one event recorded twice. And Luke doesn't include it because he doesn't have the same theological purpose. John doesn't include it because he doesn't have the same theological purpose. It's quite possible that Luke and John look at those and say, yeah, there were two events, but it doesn't, our purpose and our goal and our audience is not going to care about there being two events. Whereas in Matthew's case and Mark's case, they are. Like I said before, the similarities are not as profound as they seem on the surface. We're going to talk in general or in more specific terms, but if you look just on the surface, the length of time Jesus is with the crowd, the amount of food present before the miracle, the amount of food that's present after the miracle, the different locations indicate this is a separate event. Now, this is not focused on Old Testament examples of this. This is really just looking at the New Testament. The fact that the disciples seem to have very little faith in the second miracle is also used to emphasize, I believe, the reticence with which they understand the miracles in general. And it's meant to contrast, again, the faith that the Gentiles, the Gentile recipients of healings seem to have. And we understand that if Jesus does something once, he can do it twice. There was no such assumption on the part of the disciples. They're still working out exactly who Jesus is. Now, later in Matthew 16, we're going to see they have a pretty robust mental idea or theological idea about who Jesus is, but do they understand the full implications? Just because Jesus performed a feeding miracle once, there's no reason to believe for them sitting on the grass, sitting out in the field in the desert, the desolate wilderness after Jesus has been teaching for 3 days. They don't know how miracles work. Maybe in the first place, because they were only there a day, they're thinking, well, Jesus has still got enough energy. That's pretty good. But he's been out here 3 days. He's got to be tired. He can't perform that kind of miracle. So a lack of faith is simply that. It's a lack of faith. It doesn't mean they didn't see what was going on. If we look at John chapter 6, verse 26, after the first feeding, Jesus actually rebukes the crowd who follows him. He rebukes the crowd because they are only looking for more physical bread. So it's possible that in the second feeding, the disciples are like, well, Jesus is now, that miracle's done, it served its purpose, there's not going to be a second. That's all conjecture, and that's interpretation from silence, which is always, that's kind of a slippery slope. But what I want to emphasize is that those who believe it's one event told twice are also arguing from silence. They're making assumptions about things that are not necessarily there. And from my perspective, it makes more sense to think of it as two separate events. And also, to me, elevates the hand of God, not just in the telling of the story, but in the actual activity of the event. Any questions about doublets or lack of doublets or parallels before we get into the actual feeding here?
Jesus does say that. I mean, how do they get around that statement? I mean, Jesus uses it as a rebuke.
He does. How you mean? How do the folks that believe it's a doublet? They just believe that Matthew and Mark put those words in Jesus' mouth.
They're recorded a little bit differently too.
They are.
The numbers are not the same.
The numbers are not the same. Yeah, and that's where we're going to get into the specifics here. So that's a great. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question, Carolyn. Chronologically, how close are those events? And remember, one of the things we talked about in Matthew, it's also the case in Luke's or in Mark's gospel, less so in Luke's, although Luke is similar. The priority is not chronological, right? Like Matthew is not trying to say this happened and this happened and this. It's possible these are 18 months apart. You know, these events could be 18 months apart. He's grouped them relatively close together, but that's for a theological reason. And that doesn't diminish the historic accuracy of the event. It just means that he's grouped them differently for theme. So it is possible that there's, a lot, you got to understand, a lot happens to the disciples in a very short period of time. And can you imagine their heads are swimming constantly in the presence of Jesus? I mean, most of these men were blue-collar fishermen. Some were hated tax collectors. Some were religious zealots trying to overthrow the Roman government. I mean, we're talking about a very different group of people who've had their lives turned upside down by following Jesus. And so you're right, Carolyn. We think of the travel as like travel is like this and then you're here. But it doesn't happen like that. I mean, they're walking and boating, and it is a distance. I mean, we're talking a great distance.
Geographically, they are apart, quite a bit apart.
From the first feeding to the second feeding, yes. We're going to look at the map in just a moment. But one of the very first things that is different about this feeding versus the second feeding versus the first feeding is the expression of the motivation of Jesus. So let's read, starting with Matthew 15, beginning with verse 32. And we're going to read the entire. I'm going to read the entire piece. So Matthew chapter 15, beginning with verse 32. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I'm unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7, and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. So the motivation is very important. What has just happened in this series of events, and I think this is chronological, is Jesus has just spent time in the Decapolis healing the people there. And the result of that healing ministry is that they worship. It says, if you go back to verse 31, they glorified the God of Israel. And so you have this healing moment that is likely coupled with teaching. So teaching and healing and teaching and healing and teaching and healing. This is a 3-day event, and it does not seem, again, this is arguing from silence, but it does not seem as though the people are complaining for food. They're not coming to Jesus saying, hey, we're hungry. They're not coming to Jesus saying, hey, we need something to eat or we need to go. But Jesus recognizes their need first, and he's moved to meet it. This crowd has come to be healed. They've come to be taught, and they've responded with praise, worship of the God of Israel. So he has compassion. This word compassion in the Greek, it's the word splagnizomai. I love that word, splagnizomai. And here it is. It is a word that has a very physical connotation to it. This is a lot of Greek words that deal with emotions. They have very deep, almost physical kind of elements to them. And the word splagnizomai actually comes from the word moved to the bowels. Deep, guttural, almost a pain for the sake of others. Jesus believes that the people will faint along the way. That's how far out in the country they are and how little food they have. There's a suggestion in the word that Jesus uses. He uses the word hungry, which in the English, we've seen hunger and hungry a time or two, but this word hungry, it's only used here and in Mark's parallel version, and it's related to the word translated as fasting. The people have made a choice in this season, this 3-day period. They've made a choice to, rather than go find food to satiate their physical hunger, they've chosen to live into the beatitude where Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for what? Righteousness. They've chosen to, rather than let the hunger of their stomachs drive the train of their actions, they've chosen to hunger after Jesus. And so they've fasted in the presence of Jesus, at the feet of Jesus' teaching. And so Jesus is moved to compassion, and he says, I'm unwilling to send them away lest they faint. But the disciples again express a lack of understanding about what Jesus will do. Matthew does this, I think, to underscore the distance they have yet to travel in their faith. Something that will be made clear in chapter 16, verse 8, just a few verses later. Notice what Jesus does not do in this moment. What does he not do? What does Jesus not say to the disciples at this time? He doesn't say, "You of little faith." He doesn't take this as a moment to teach the disciples, because he's still moved to compassion for the crowd. Now he will say, "Oh, you of little faith," later, but this is not the moment for it. Jesus is choosing a time to what he's concerned about in this moment is making sure that the crowds are taken care of. The motivation of his compassion is the compelling sentiment of his life at this moment. And so, but notice who does the gathering of the food? Not Jesus. Again, it's the disciples. I think this is a small but very important detail that it happens in these sorts of large-scale ministries with Jesus. Jesus is the one that performs the work. Jesus is the one that calls to action, but he also motivates and empowers his disciples to do the larger work. This is ultimately what happens in his post-resurrection commission to the disciples. Go therefore into all the world. Based on his authority. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me in Matthew 28. Go therefore into all the world and make disciples. Jesus is the one that causes the bread to miraculously multiply and the fish to miraculously multiply, but he gives those tools to his disciples to complete the work. So the same thing will happen ultimately in the church era, the ecclesiastical age. So, how much food do they gather at this time? 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. Now, what few small fish, sardines, uncooked fish, small uncooked fish. How much is gathered in the feeding of the 5,000? Now, how much is started with? 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5 loaves and 2 fish. So, you guys are all math whizzes, right? So we have how much? 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. Now, are we told how many? No. And how many in the feeding of the 5,000? It's actually 5 loaves. 5 loaves. And specifically told 2 fish. Somebody want to help me out here? 5 plus 2 equals what? 7. Okay, so there is a reason in the first place we're told the specific number of fish and the specific number of loaves, and in the second place we're only told the number of loaves because they know there's 7. Because what happens if you say, instead of a few fish, you say 4 fish? It throws the math off. Now, does it lessen the miracle? No. But it throws the math off. So the math must be important. The math must be important. As we talked about thank you for bearing with me on that. That was just a little joke. There's a conscious parallel. This is one of the reasons I believe it's 2 separate events. Because if it wasn't 2 separate events, then Matthew would have said the exact same number, 5 loaves and 2 fish. But instead he highlights that it's a different number, but it ultimately yields the same result. And here's the thing that does get a little bit tricky with some people. The actual physical historic number is not as important as what that represents. The number 7, as we talked about over and over, numerologically in the Bible, is extremely important. It is the number of God's provisional fullness. How do we know that? In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. And how many days does it take? Actually, it takes 6 days, guys. But what happens he adds the 7th day for what? Now, does God need rest? In fact, the Bible says that God neither slumbers nor sleeps. So why the 7th day? For us to understand, for us to understand the importance of the Sabbath, but also for us to understand that in God is the fullness of all that is needed for anything. So that number 7, you see that pop up, it's the fullness of all that is needed for God to do whatever he needs to do. So we have 5 loaves and 2 fish and 7 loaves and a few fish. Still 7. And honestly, if it was 8 loaves and 3 fish, or 3 loaves and 17 fish, it wouldn't matter. Because whatever was available, whatever is there, is what is necessary for God to do what he's going to do. Whatever is there is necessary for God to do what he's going to do. Whatever Jesus has is enough to provide for the needs of his people. This is why in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says to his people, why do you worry? Why do you worry? Look at the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. They have exactly what they need. They don't worry about it. They don't spin, they don't sow, they don't go to jobs. They have exactly what they need, and God cares for them. Then, this also relates to what's left over. So what is given at the beginning is different than what's left over, and what's available at the end is also different than what is left over. At the end, how many baskets of food are left? In the first place, or in the second place, in the second feeding, there are 7 baskets left. And in the first place, this is a different number altogether. How many? 12. Now, the number 12, as if you were here with us a few weeks ago, the number 12 relates to what? The 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 disciples. The disciples being the reconstitution of the 12 tribes. I mentioned this before. That's why in the new heavens and the new earth, when John sees the apocalyptic vision of the throne room of God, how many elders are worshiping Jesus in the throne room? How many? 24. $24 equals 12 times 2. This is like, I'm blowing myself away with my math skill today. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples, 24. But in the case of the first, again, if you take the theological premise of the feedings, the mass feedings, the 12 tribes of Israel are somewhat more in view because this is a feeding to the Jewish community, for the Jewish community. Is it exclusively Jewish people at the first feeding? Probably not. But from a theological kind of weightiness, it demonstrates the Jewish anticipation promise of the eschatological banquet. In the second place, you don't have another 12, you have 7. Again, going back to that idea of fullness and completion. It's full and it's complete when the Gentiles are engrafted into the community. That's always, always, always been the promise of God to his people. Always been the promise of God, and Jesus is living that out. Yes, Jesus came to be the Messiah to the Jewish people, but the Jewish people were always supposed to be a blessing to all the nations. Therefore, Jesus is a blessing to all the nations.
In the second feeding, you say there were 7 loaves, and they don't know how many fish.
They don't tell us how many fish, yes. Correct.
That had been 5 to make 7 and 5 to be 12, which is also
Could have been.
significant number.
Could have been. Again, the number that's actually present is not as much as important as what Matthew is reporting to us for the reasons that he reports it to us. So Jesus does so where the two feedings coincide it really comes down to what Jesus does in the activity of the miracle. what does he do? He takes the bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and he gave it to his disciples. It's almost verbatim. And for those that deny that there's some Eucharistic connection to the feeding of the 5,000, I just don't think you're reading it very well. Did Matthew have that in mind? Did Mark have that in mind? Did John have that in mind? I cannot, in the way I look at this, cannot think that when they're writing the events, they're not thinking of what Jesus is ultimately going to do in the upper room because of what it ultimately leads to the cross. Because what is Jesus doing at the cross? He's providing for us. He's providing for us not in our physical need, but in our spiritual need in the forgiveness of sins. So, you see some of the similarities and some of the difference, but we also cannot miss in both feedings that there is an important, we can't miss the importance of the abundance theme. There's an overflow of Christ's compassion. There's an overflow of Christ's provision for all the people. So from here, it says that Jesus and his disciples, or that Jesus got into a boat and went to the region of Magadan. Now, there's a problem with this. So rightly so, we got to understand Jesus is in this area right here, the southeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. And in the first feeding, he's in the northeast corner, just outside of Bethsaida. Then he has the boat situation where Peter walks on water. They end up in Gennesaret, which is right here. Then they end up in the Decapolis. We do not know that from Matthew's gospel. We know that from Mark's gospel, but they're parallel passages, so we can go one to one. Now, when you go to the parallel passage in Mark that talks about the miraculous feeding, it doesn't say Magadan. Does anyone know what it says? Anyone have it? Has anyone been looking at it? Don't worry, I'll tell you. It's Dalmanutha. Dalmanutha. But there is a textual variant. Now, what I mean by textual variants, what I mean is when the translators of the Bible are translating the Bible, they have all of these texts that record the parts of Mark, and they have, they'll have, because how the original Gospels were transmitted is they're transmitted by scribes copying them out. They have a copy, so they handwrite it, and then they move it on. They write another copy, and they move it on. And so we have fragments of all of these texts of Mark and Matthew and Luke and John and da-da-da-da. And then modern translators have to take those texts and decide which ones are the most accurate because there are variants. Why are there variants? Because anyone who's ever had to physically copy the work of someone else knows you're going to make mistakes. They didn't have copy and paste where it's like perfect. They had to handwrite it. And guess what? You're writing like this for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. What's going to happen? You're going to get tired. Your eyes are going to get crossed. You're going to miss a line. You're going to miss a word. And you just keep going because otherwise if you go back and so sometimes you'll see in the text they'll scratch something out and they'll go back and write it over top. And translators have to look at all those things and say, well, which text is right? And they have a grading system about which text is probably most historically accurate, and then ones that are less historically accurate, and which ones are on and on and on. So when I say textual variant, that means that they have another copy of Mark's gospel that uses a different town. And you guys know what the town is that they use? Magadan. Or, and this is where it gets really interesting, a place called Magdala. We do not know where Magadan is. We don't know where Dalmanutha is either. But we do know approximately where Magdala is. And it is right there, just north of Tiberias on the western coast of the Sea of Galilee. Now, why do I say that? Why do I give you all that? Because critical biblical scholars will say, well, see, this is evidence of the Bible's inaccuracy. This is evidence of the Bible's unreliability. And it's really not. Again, just because who knows if Magdala was also called Magadan by certain groups of people, or if it's in a specific region called Dalmanutha, or that the governor at the time was called, or the leader of that region was called Dalmanutha, or what? We don't know. Just because we don't know doesn't mean something is wrong. And that there's this kind of intellectual arrogance that a lot of scholars read the Bible with. Well, if I don't know, then it must be inaccurate rather than me just lacking knowledge. Or maybe something hasn't been discovered yet. So I just say that because when you read Mark's gospel and you read that, wait a minute, Mark says this and Matthew says this, and I read in my commentary, we have absolutely no idea where Magadan is. But we do know where Magdala is. And so we can make a case, at least a case, that these are one in the same areas. So from there, Jesus is moved to Magadan, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees show up once again. So let's read chapter 16 for just a moment. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered them, when it's evening, you say it will be fair sky, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to you except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. So we'll stop right there for just a moment. The scribes and the Pharisees, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees, are here giving Jesus a similar test to the one we saw in Matthew chapter 12. Again, not a doublet, because there are some key differences. In Matthew 12, it was the scribes and Pharisees. Here, it's the Sadducees and Pharisees. And this makes it problematic because in our heads, the Sadducees and the Pharisees are two sides of the same coin. Whereas in Jesus' own time, the Sadducees and the Pharisees were like Democrats and Republicans. They didn't want to be in the same room together. They didn't want to be in the same, they didn't want to breathe the same air. They didn't like each other. They had very rival doctrines. And so they did not show up often together. In fact, in Matthew, the Sadducees are not mentioned with the Pharisees except one other time earlier up to this point in Matthew chapter 3, verse 7. But here they come out because Jesus has taken to directly challenging the Pharisees, and so they want to see what this rabbi is all about and if he will be a threat to their status as well. And so they ask him a question, and it's not mentioned this way in Matthew 12, but in Matthew 16, they ask him the question for what reason? To test him. Matthew 12, there's no mention of a test. So we're not given the motivation of the Pharisees and the scribes, but we are of the scribes and the Sadducees. And specifically, they're asking for a sign, not in general, what sign will you give us, but what sign from where? Heaven. So they are specifically asking for not just a divine symbol or miraculous symbol. They're asking for an irrefutable sign that Jesus is something special, divine, that he is who he says he is. Now, I want you to understand, Jesus has already raised people from the dead. Not to mention he's given sight to the blind and made the lame walk. Oh, and by the way, he's fed like 20,000 people with just about 14 loaves of bread and a handful of fish. No. That's not enough. They want something more. This is why Jesus answers as he does. This is why Jesus points to the ways that people already make interpretations of what's going to happen. He does this by looking at the weather. He says people already know how to interpret the work of God in nature. And this phrase that Jesus uses about the red sky at night, red sky in the morning, it's actually a pretty ancient kind of concept. There's actually sailors would say, red sky in the morning, sailor take warning. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. You'll notice the last several days it's been pink at night and it's been beautiful. We've had no bad, like, rainy weather. So Jesus is saying, look, your common understanding of God's work in creation, you can get that. But you can't see what I'm doing as a sign of the Messianic age. You can't see that. And the underlying tone is they obviously don't know the prophets. Remember, again, I've mentioned this because it's a key passage in Matthew's text. When the disciples of John the Baptist come to ask Jesus if he's the Messiah, what does he say? He says, report to them what you have seen. The blind have their sight, the lame walk, the deaf hear. And what he's doing is he's pointing back to the prophet Isaiah, who mentions those specifically as signs of the Messianic age. And so he's like, what else do you want? And so he reiterates the rebuke from Matthew 12. Matthew 12, he says the same thing. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. And we talked about the sign of Jonah when we talked about Matthew chapter 12. But when Jesus speaks this rebuke, there is a kind of an assumption that they have, at least this crowd of people, this crowd of religious leaders coming to talk to him, that they've heard. If the Pharisees are some of the same Pharisees as the ones in Matthew 12, they've heard this rebuke twice. And those who didn't probably heard of the rebuke that Jesus gave them. So Jesus is giving an extra emphasis behind the rebuke and behind the sign. The sign is the sign of Jonah. And what is the sign of Jonah? In Matthew 12, he gives a more full explanation of what that is. In Matthew 16, he's assuming they've already heard this explanation. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days in the heart of the earth, right? In the belly of the earth. And so he's pointing to his own resurrection. If they want a sign that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, just wait 3 days. He's coming back. He will raise from the dead. They did not comprehend that. They did not understand that. And so they departed and they left him. I'm going to pause right here because I don't want to start on the next, because there's a couple things I want to make sure we have some time to get into. I don't want to rush it. Any questions about that? Because we're going to continue talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees next week, but how Jesus interprets the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and by association, the scribes and the other religious leaders, how he interprets that to the disciples and the disciples' lack of understanding. Any questions about the miraculous feeding or the relationship of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the scribes? I don't have any answers, but you can ask the questions. I'm just kidding. Yeah, Pearl.
I have a question.
1526.
Yeah, I don't know who is the dog, who is children. I know children is Jewish, but who is dog? We are the dog or children?
The Gentiles, in that case, when Jesus is talking to the woman who is the Canaanite, he's talking about, so she's not one of God's people. She's outside of the tribe of Israel or the people of Israel. And so he's saying the dogs, the Canaanites would often be referred to as dogs, right? Because they were outside that camp. But also they were looked down upon because they were enemies. They were not just Gentiles, they were enemies of God's people. And so it is a harsh statement, but Jesus is saying that he's come for the children of Israel. That's what we talked about last week. He's come for the children of Israel, but this woman's faith demonstrates, and it's almost a tongue-in-cheek sort of thing that Jesus is doing here. He's being serious, but he's also saying this for the sake of the disciples to understand that his presence. And as we get into the feeding of the 4,000, as we got into the feeding of the 4,000, that his power and his work, it is for the Jewish people, but that the blessing of the Jewish people has always meant to expand to the Gentiles, which includes us. So yes, in that case, as harsh as it sounds on the surface, we are the dogs. Yeah, go ahead, Carolyn, and then we'll go back.
In the next verse,
Yeah.
the forthright answer of the woman so quick, did Jesus know that she would say that, or was she just so bright that she said that?
Would he know? That's a good question. Would Jesus know, or was she just that quick and faith-filled? You know, it's funny because I had a conversation with Josh Schweitzer. Josh Schweitzer came to my office this week, and we were talking about how limited was Jesus' knowledge in his incarnation? Because we obviously know there were times Jesus didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, he says as much. There are times. There are also times he miraculously knows what's going to happen. Because it says, there are several times where Jesus says, knowing what was in their hearts, like he knew what they were thinking before they said it. Sometimes he doesn't seem to know that. And sometimes he outright says, like when we get to the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus is talking about the signs of the end of the age, he says, not even the Son of Man knows the day or the hour. So does he know in this case, or is the woman just filled with so much faith? I think whether Jesus knew or not, the fact that the woman exhibited so much faith was not so much for him, it was for the disciples. Because what are the disciples trying to do right up to that point? Get her away, come on, she's bothering us. And Jesus is like, yeah, I get what you're saying, disciples, that I'm here for the Israelite people, but God has made it so that the blessing of the Israelite people is for everyone. Pearl, did you have something else?
I'm not understand completely. So
It's still one of the hardest things to understand, I think, of all the things that Jesus says that we have recorded, the red letters, and you guys know how I feel about red letters, but of all the red letters, which, by the way, my Bible has red letters in it, but of all the red letters, these are some of the toughest words to understand because it seems so out of character.
I know Jewish people is the children for
Yes.
and the dog is for others. So now we are from dog become children.
Yes. Yes. We go from this status as now again, is that Jesus' mentality? Is he actually speaking from his own mentality, or is he speaking from the mentality of the Jewish people? And he's throwing that in their face. He's throwing that as a false mentality. Because what we also can't get past is that he says to this woman, great is your faith. And then he tells his disciples, not once, not twice, not 3 times, how little faith they have. So there is a tongue-in-cheek, there's an irony to what Jesus is saying for the sake of the disciples. The disciples have this prejudice. They have a prejudice against the Canaanite woman. They have a prejudice against the Gentile people. And Jesus is calling that prejudice out. I believe it. I believe he's calling that prejudice out and saying, I come from the children, and it's not right to give the children, give the dogs the children's bread. He's calling out that prejudice and then showing that this woman is actually a child of God.
Oh yes, and the woman from dog becomes to child just by the face.
Yes, absolutely. It's complicated. It's big. Last question, Nancy.
It's not so much a question, it's just how many times he shows the disciples up with using these things. I mean, because they're so organized in the sense of the blind man calling out to him, no, get out of the way,
Yeah.
we've got a place to go. They're always on this mission to move forward, and it really bugs them the way Jesus will just stop
Yeah.
for one person.
The wrong person, too, by the way. It's almost always the wrong person.
And what James and John did, with how they were about the
Mhm.
Canaanites, and he was just like, look, back off. You can't rain down fire
Yeah.
on somebody just because they're different from you.
And we're going to see that again in a few chapters when you have the situation with the children, right? The little children. So we're going to see a similar situation there. You're going to have this over and over again. And lest we get too arrogant in our chronological distance, the rebuke that Jesus gives the disciples, we got to take that personally. We have to own that too. We have to say, well, where is it that I treat people as lesser than just because of their status? And I'm not saying any of us do this consciously, but we have a lot of unconscious things that we do, where we make snap judgments. We make cast dispersions internally, and where we have to check those things as well. Let's pray, and then we'll pick up next week. Lord, thank you for your goodness to us, for the great provision of your love, and pray, Lord, that we would be the sort of people that exhibit that provision to others through your grace and mercy and love. Transform us by the sway of your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.